Welcome to Financial Pearls of Wisdom with Erin Ardleigh. In each episode, an expert will share a pearl of wisdom from their industry. This podcast will provide a deep dive on important topics in personal finance that even savvy consumers and industry professionals may not know. You can find the show on all the major platforms, including YouTube, LinkedIn, Facebook, Apple Podcasts, and Spotify. Now here's the host of Financial Pearls of Wisdom, Erin Ardleigh.
Thank you for listening to my podcast. I'm Erin Ardleigh. I'm the founder of Dynama Insurance, an independent insurance brokerage based in New York City, and I'm also the host of the Financial Pearls of Wisdom podcast. After 20 years of helping successful families and individuals with their insurance, I've interacted with so many experienced professionals, attorneys, accountants, wealth advisors, and others. And I decided to start this podcast to share their valuable insights and expertise with you. I hope you'll gain a few pearls of wisdom from each episode as I interview a different expert from the world of personal finance. Today's guest is matrimonial attorney and author Jacqueline Newman. Jacqueline is the managing partner of Berkman Bottger Newman Schein, a law firm based in New York City focused exclusively on matrimonial law. Jacqueline, thank you so much for being my guest.
Thank you so much for having me.
Well, divorce, of course, can have a huge impact on personal finance. So I think our listeners will enjoy the insights that they'll gain from you today. Your firm is known for offering different ways to get divorced. I'm not sure everyone knows that there's options when it comes to that. So I'd love for you to share a little bit about the different options and how your firm navigates those.
Sure. So as you said, most people believe that you need to be inside of a courtroom in order to get divorced. And that's just simply not true. So we say there are three ways to get divorced. There's litigation, there's collaborative law, and there's mediation. So just to start with mediation. So mediation is where you work with one neutral person who will work with both parties to try to bring them to a conclusion. When I'm a mediator, I do all three. So for me, it doesn't really matter which one you do, even though I do think that some are better than others. So when you're a mediator, you are the neutral person, and I always recommend that people have attorneys on the outside, because as a neutral mediator, you need to make sure that you have somebody that's looking at your case from your vantage point. So that's a very important thing. One thing I just want to say about mediation is that mediators are not judges, and so they are not making decisions for the couple. So you really have to have ownership when you decide that you want to mediate. Then let's say you say, you know what, I'm not comfortable not having attorneys in the room. I need a little bit more support. And so then there's collaborative law. So collaborative law is where you work with collaboratively trained attorneys, which means we go through a lot of training, and you enter into an agreement saying you're not going to go to court. So there's a very, very big push on settlement. The kicker to collaborative law is that in the event that the process breaks down and it's voluntary, so either party can say, we don't want to do this anymore. At that point, not only do you have to stop working with all the professionals in the process, including the attorneys, but you also can't work with anyone else in their firm. So for an example, if let's say I'm representing the husband and we think everything's going great in the collaborative process, and all of a sudden the wife says, you know what, I don't want to do this anymore. Not only am I out, but my entire firm is out. And so again, a really big push on settlement. The other thing that's very nice about the collaborative approach is it's an interdisciplinary approach, which means that we bring in divorce coaches, we bring in financial neutrals, child specialists if applicable. I always say I'm the most expensive player on the team, so why wouldn't you bring in these other professionals? It's a great process, and again, it's somewhat self-selecting because it is neutral and it's voluntary. But those are generally those two things. And then we have litigation, which is what everybody hears about. That's what's on TV. And I would say that, litigation doesn't even necessarily mean you're going into the courtroom, but it does mean it's not the other two options. And so in litigation is kind of what you think it is. A lot of times it's the attorneys negotiating directly, but yes, you can definitely have a court involved. And, I personally, I do a lot of all three, mostly probably litigation at this exact moment, more than I want to be. And I will tell you, litigation is a very, very difficult process. Sometimes you have no choice. That's what you have to do. But it's very expensive. It is very emotionally expensive, financially expensive, and it's difficult, and it takes a very long time. So of all the process choices, I think that, litigation should probably be your last resort. But again, sometimes it's just necessary.
Do you see a lot of people that start with mediation or collaborative law, but still have to switch to litigation because things break down? Or do you see a lot of success rates with those other two options where people do avoid the litigation?
So, it's a great question. It's a very self-selecting process. So those that choose to do mediation or collaborative law, arguably they're going into it with the mindset that they don't want to be litigating. I think if you probably asked anyone, they'd say, I don't want to be litigating. But conceptually, there really is a difference. Like you can tell when somebody is just kind of doing this because they want to stay out of court or because they're really committed to the process. So I would say, if I was going to guess right now, I would say we're probably looking at an 80-20 split. I think that I would say about 80% of the people that choose those two voluntary processes, they can be successful. I think there's about 20% that just think that they can do it, but they can't. Because it's a hard process to do. As I said, you have to own your decisions. Going into litigation, you turn to the judge and you say, you give it your best shot, and then the judge makes the decision for you, as opposed to the other two process options where you have to say, you know what, I have to make this decision. And that's a hard thing for people to do. And so, yeah, I would say basically, it does happen, though, that people will start in the first process choices and then end up in litigation. But, custody is one of the hardest things to litigate. So I say if you can do custody and mediation or collaborative law, and then you have to litigate finances, it's a million times better than having to go through a custody fight.
Interesting. And do all attorneys practice all three areas of law, or is this something that only certain attorneys would have the expertise or training to offer?
So yeah, you have to go through a lot of training to do a mediation and to do collaborative law. So no, I would say there are definitely some people that just litigate. There are some people that just do collaborative law, and then there are some people that just do mediation. So I think it's fairly rare to do all three. It's one of the things that my firm really prides ourselves on is the fact that we do offer all three options. And, one of the things I say is that being that, I do all three, I'm not necessarily trying to sell you one or another. My hourly rate's the same no matter what you choose. So I think that that's kind of a nice thing, because if you go to a mediator, someone's going to say you should do mediation. If you go to a collaborative attorney, collaborative law. If you go to a litigator. So for me, I'm just, come in and let's figure out what's the best process for you.
That's great. That's similar to my firm, where we represent all the major insurance companies. So we don't have a reason to push one versus another. But I tell people all the time, if you call an agent that works at an insurance company, they're going to tell you that their products are the best because they're supposed to do that. That's their employer. So same. I think that's something we see across areas in personal finance, where you have to realize where the allegiances of the person you're speaking to lie and how they get paid. And they don't have an incentive to send you to the competition if they don't offer what it is you really do need.
No, I absolutely agree.
We see that a lot. So you said preparing for a case as if it were going to trial is often the best way to avoid one. Can you tell me a little bit more about that?
So yeah, I mean, unfortunately, you always kind of, in my field, you have to live in the worst case scenario. So you always have to assume that, things are not going to go the way you want them to, in which case I think you do need to be prepared. When you're prepared to go to trial, odds are you won't. I think it's only when you're not prepared to go to trial that things blow up. So I think it is just a very important process choice. A very important thought process to basically be working through all of your cases with the idea that it could be a trial. You never want to be in a situation where you do something in the beginning of a case because you are assuming everything's going to work out well, and then it kind of gets you, bites you later on. So I think it's just very, very important to be cautious all the way through. Unfortunately, we're dealing with people that are very emotional, and you really don't know what's going to happen. You can make some predictions, but sometimes they're wrong. So you just have to be prepared for everything.
So even with the mediation cases or the collaborative law cases, you're still in the back of your mind thinking, if we go to trial, I want to make sure I've laid the groundwork for that.
So when I'm acting in the mediator capacity, I'm the neutral. So I'm not going to be necessarily thinking that from them. But if I'm what I call it, mediation friendly attorneys, where if I'm on the other side and I'm just basically helping through the process, in the back of my mind, I am thinking that just to make sure. And then in the collaborative process, you're out. So you're never not going to be in a situation of litigating it. But again, knowing that I do litigate and I do have a sense of that, I want to set up my client and just make sure that they're protected in the event that this does break down. And then obviously, if you start out in the litigation situation, you have to obviously be preparing at all times.
Right. That makes sense. So attorneys obviously work in different states, and your firm has offices in several different states, but certainly not all of our listeners are going to be in a state where they could contact you for help. What are some tips for hiring an attorney for people who might be contemplating divorce? What are some of the best practices or the questions that you would suggest someone ask if they're not just simply hiring you?
It's a hard process, I think, to find a good divorce attorney for you, because one of the things is, first of all, a lot of people don't want to tell anyone they're looking for a divorce attorney. So, you will have people that don't want to talk to other people about it. And you'll have a lot of people that go on the internet. And so while there are, people on the internet that can be really helpful, there are a lot of people that just pay a lot in, SEO fees and ultimately are not really going to be excellent attorneys. So I do suggest that some people look at outside sources. There are super lawyers. There's Martindale, which is lawyers.com. You can see how people are being rated. If you can get a sense of, if you can speak to some people, objectively being like you have a friend that's getting divorced, just to try to get a little bit of the lay of the land of who's really good and who's not, I think it is important. But when you're going and meeting with an attorney, one of the things that I think is very important is how hard are they selling you? That to me is like the sign. I mean, that's the sign of my thing with everything. And, Erin, as you know, you do my insurance, and I can say that I appreciate very much that you are never, ever the hard sell. So that to me is a really, telling thing. And I think even more so when you're dealing with people that are, going through a divorce. And so one of the things that I know I ask people when they first come in is like, are you sure you want to get divorced? And if people pause for a nanosecond, I am a big advocate of go to see a marriage counselor. Like, you don't go through it unless you're sure. I think there's a ton of strategy to divorce. People come in all hot and, ready to kill. And I'm always just like, slow it down. Like, let's talk about it. Let's see what actually makes sense. Because the timing of divorce is super important. So when you're interviewing attorneys, if someone's like, let's file tomorrow, ask them why. Start talking, like really kind of question them. Don't just take them at their word and say, would this make sense for me? So for an example, if you have somebody who is a moneyed spouse, when I say moneyed, obviously the person that may be controlling more of the finances, or actually, let's do it this way. Let's say you're representing the non-moneyed spouse and you go to see an attorney and they say, we should file right away. I would say, well, why would you do that? Because every day that goes by that you don't file a summons, the income that person's earning is ultimately going to be marital. So when I'm representing the non-moneyed spouse, unless that person is dissipating assets, unless there's some reason, unless I think they're going to quit their job or there's something going to happen in their company, I am always like, we're not going to file. Like, there's no reason to do it. Not to mention, and this is a smaller issue and people may have different strategies on it, but when you think about litigation, if you file first, you're called the plaintiff and you get to go first in trial. Personally, I never really want to be the one to go first. I would much rather be the defendant. For many reasons. One, that you are preparing for trial, and cases usually more often than not settle usually on the first or second day of trial. So if I'm the defendant, well, you have to prepare. You don't have to prepare to the degree that a plaintiff does. So I think there are just many, many strategies as to why you'd file or not file. And if you go to visit an attorney and that attorney says file right away and you're the non-moneyed spouse, I would just want to know why they think that. There may be a good reason. So I don't want to automatically say never, ever file. But I think that some people just need to think this through a little bit more.
I think too, if people feel like they are emotionally being, maybe some emotional strings are being pulled, that's also not a good sign, right? If you have that feeling of this person isn't making you comfortable or this person is pushing you outside of your comfort zone, people should listen to those feelings, those vibes that they get, because many times they're right. They may not be able to put their finger on the exact reason and say, well, in this profession, this made me uncomfortable and it was because of this. But usually when I talk to people and they had a bad experience, it was they felt something and there wasn't a connection and they should have listened to that instinct. So that's, I think, probably really important with the attorney. You're going to be sharing a lot of intimate details with your matrimonial attorney, and you want to feel like they get you and they're on your side and they understand you, I would think.
Right. I would also say, just to add to that, you don't feel judged. I think that is a super important thing. I think when people come into initial consultations, first of all, they want to be liked because everyone wants to be liked. And they also don't want to feel like they're obnoxious. Like, they don't want to really tell you everything because in some way they don't want to feel judged. They're judging themselves. There's a lot of emotional stuff going on in that. It's a lot of emotional conflict. And so I think it's super important for you just not to feel judged. And I say to clients very often, like, trust me, you're not going to shock me. And also, like, I'm not going to judge you. That's not my job. But I think that has to be the comfort level, because to your point, they have to tell us everything, because the worst thing a client can do is not tell you something because they're scared of being judged. They think you're not going to like them, or you're going to think you're a bad person. And then you don't have that information. And then you go to court or any process choice, and somebody throws that at you and you're not prepared. It's the worst thing a client can do. And so, I definitely think that you need to be with someone that you feel you can tell everything to.
That makes sense. I bet people don't necessarily go into a divorce realizing just how much they're going to have to reveal. And so they don't necessarily think of that as an important characteristic or important, quality in their attorney necessarily. But I bet as time goes on, being able to really trust that person and let your hair down, so to speak, and confide in that person is going to make a big difference. So, you spoke a little bit about, how to hire an attorney and also some of the mistakes people made or some of the things people don't think about. What are some of the mistakes you think people make when they are contemplating divorce, or what are some of the top mistakes you see that maybe we could help our listeners avoid making?
So I'm going to say what is probably the obvious, but it's the emotions. People come in all house of fire. They want to kill somebody. They're just like, they want to call the IRS. They want to do all these different things just to punish the other person. And, especially like, I'll just talk about the IRS one for a second. Like, you have, I represent a lot of business owners, and not to say that they all should be called to the IRS, but the fact is that you do have people that may be, running their business in a way that ultimately they would not like to be investigated. And so I think when you have the spouse that takes a position of, well, I know all these things going on and I'm going to, report them, I'm always like, slow it down. Like, you don't want to kill the golden goose. Not to mention the fact that, people are not aware of the fact that if they know that there's, let's say, cash in the business or whatever's maybe going on, and they're signing tax returns, they claim, well, I didn't really know. You knew. And in order to claim what they would say, well, I'll be an innocent spouse, which is a tax phrase to kind of say I didn't know what was going on. It's very hard to get. And so at the end of the day, you see a lot of people that come in and they're just so fired up and they just want revenge, and they're really not stepping back and thinking about the practicalities of what this would look like for them, for their family, for their spouse. And so it's just very important to kind of, as much as you can, compartmentalize the emotions from the reality and from the practicality. And it's hard, I'm not going to pretend that's an easy thing to do. And a lot of times it takes time to get to that place. And I think it's sort of my job to sort of slow them down a little bit and kind of try to throw a little bit of, cold water on the fire, shall we say, to say that, you need to really look at this right now. And I know how angry you are. And as much as you don't believe you'll be less angry in a month from now, you will, and things are going to be different. And so again, even to tie it back to hiring the attorney, when you get an attorney that just jumps on the bandwagon and is like, you're right, your spouse is terrible, and just really kind of feeds into that, I think that's another sign you want to watch out for, because you don't need a mirror. You need somebody who's really going to advocate for you, but advocating for you may also mean advocating against you to the degree of showing you what's the right path to go. And so I think that that's just a super important thing. And people, they miss it, because they are just so angry. And, sometimes clients don't appreciate that kind of direct advice, but that's the way I like to practice. And so I think it's just important to kind of really steer people in the right directions. That's going to help them, in a bigger picture than where they might be at that exact moment.
Right. So keeping the emotion out of it, and also making them realize that what might feel good today is not really strategic, 3, 4, 5 steps down the road. So might be fun to make that phone call or burn that, whatever down. Right. But you might not want to own that in court, 3 months later or 3 years later or whatnot. So
revenge and principles are very expensive. So I think it's really worth where you want to put your money as opposed to your kid's college, maybe.
Right. That makes sense. And what about prenups? What about people who are considering getting married and the thought of ever getting divorced is terrifying to them? Who needs a prenup, and what should people do if they're contemplating getting one?
So prenups are a huge part of my practice. I actually think they are a great thing to get in most cases, even though I know that they're emotionally challenging, and they can be. And I actually would say that, just to talk for a minute about the emotional element of prenups, you get a lot of people that say, well, I'm planning my divorce. They're so unromantic, all of these things. But divorce isn't romantic. And the fact is you are entering into a legal contract with someone. And so in that circumstance, you want to know what your legal rights would be. You need to make this an educated decision. And I know that totally sounds unromantic, but what I would say about that is that, one of the things that I've experienced and I think really can help people in their marriages is that they learn to have a difficult conversation. One of the things that prenuptial agreements will do is you'll be talking about money, and you'll be talking about what money means to you, because money means something different to so many different people. And there's full financial disclosure, which I think is also an important thing. It's amazing to me how many people don't talk about their finances when they're dating. And I understand, again, maybe it sounds a little like, inappropriate to talk about money, but you know what, if you're marrying someone, nothing should be off the table. Like, everything should be discussed. I think there should be full transparency, and communication is key. So that's when someone's thinking about getting a prenup. First of all, I think that you have to be prepared for full financial disclosure, which again, not everybody loves, but that's an important part of it. People should both have attorneys, which again, some people are like, oh, they'll just sign anything. I was like, no. Like, that's like the worst thing you can do. Like, everybody needs an attorney. The people that I think should get one, anyone who wants any kind of certainty upon a divorce, because laws are constantly changing. But really, I would say business owners. I think that that's kind of a key thing for business owners, because that really gets incredibly complex. If you have a second marriage, you might want one. If you have family money, that could be an important time, even though there are many reasons you might not need one with family money if you do proper estate planning. You're going to want them if there is a really big discrepancy in your incomes. You may want one, you may not, but that might be something. If you anticipate a liquidity event during your marriage that you want to be protecting. So there's lots of reasons why people want to do it. And, look, again, they're become much more commonplace, I can say specifically in New York. I don't feel like they have the taboo element that they may have in other places. At least, I guess in my office they don't. But I think that they're just important to even have the conversation. Even if you end up not doing it, I think it's important for people to walk into an educated conversation, an educated marriage, knowing the finances, knowing how people look at money, being on the same page with money, because again, that's something I see a lot. So whether you decide to have one or not, you should always explore, in my opinion, the concept of it, and then you can make an educated decision whether you want to do it or not.
And you can make that decision together, which is giving you an opportunity to discuss something that may be a little bit uncomfortable and make a decision together and have an agreement, which is, really helpful, attitude going into a marriage. So I like how you've taken something that has a little bit of a taboo that many people are uncomfortable discussing or approaching, and you're giving it a new light. And this is a responsible and collaborative effort that you could make together that helps start your marriage off on the right foot.
That would be the plan, yes. And I tell everyone, once you sign it, hopefully you put it in a drawer and never take it out again. It's always nice to know.
Yes, that makes sense. And what is the timing people should do prenups? I mean, I've definitely seen people wait too late, and then it's too close to the marriage, and then it's just incredibly stressful. Then they have to look at postnuptial agreements, and that's a whole different game. But what would you say is the ideal time frame for someone to have that discussion, the exploration or exploratory conversation, I should say, with their fiance?
I mean, the sooner the better. To your point, you do get people that walk in, and we call it the shadow of the altar prenups, and that is just a terrible feeling. I've had people that are doing that, they're dress fitting, and I hear them, and I've heard the dressmaker say, stop crying on your dress. Like, it's awful. So you really, the more that you can do it earlier, the better. Unfortunately, a lot of people don't do that because they put it off because they don't want to be dealing with these kind of difficult conversations. But it's a terrible thing to do, in my opinion. You want to get this done fast. You want to get this done early, and then you put it away, and then you plan your wedding in a happy way. But, and then also, to the degree, you never know how long things are going to take. You don't know what the negotiations are going to be. And I will say this, you should also, if you find that someone is negotiating in a way that may be off-putting to you, that's some information you might want to know early. The last thing you want to do is find out, days before your wedding that you're not marrying the person you thought you were marrying. So, and then you'll end up in my office again, like right after the wedding. So the earlier the better, in my opinion. New York doesn't have an actual rule, but when people do challenge prenups, one of the things can be the fact that it's before the wedding. That in itself will definitely not overturn a prenup, but with other factors, it could be a challenge. So just be smart about it. Do it as soon as you know you're getting married, get it done, and then put it away. And that's it.
give yourself a deadline, maybe say, we're going to give ourselves 2 or 3 months to just get this finished and then move on to tasting cake and getting the dress fittings or all the fun stuff.
Yes, no, absolutely.
That's great advice. And I think one of the things I wanted to, get out there with this podcast is getting people to have conversations about things that can sometimes be uncomfortable. That I've worked with a lot of women as well. And, women will say, I don't want to get insurance because I feel like I'm overweight or because I have this health issue that I feel shy about discussing. And, I think the more we can tell people it's okay to have these conversations and don't make it taboo. And, we want you to find people that you trust and you can work with and you can share these things so that it doesn't impede you from getting the advice you need or taking the action that you need. So I love that you're giving a positive slant on prenups. I think that'll be beneficial to a lot of people if they could view it in that way as something positive and starting a marriage off on a wrong foot rather than being negative and, already having negative thoughts.
Right.
I like the positive spin. So. Well, I have talked about a lot of different areas of matrimonial law, and I hope everyone listening has learned something. But I wanted to close by asking you, Jacqueline, what is your pearl of wisdom from the matrimonial law world that you would like to leave our listeners with?
So I have a few, but I'll give a top one. I think the way you start a divorce is very telling of how you'll end your divorce. So to the degree, and you talk about with the process choices and all of these things, I think it's important if you come in, fires, guns blazing, you're going to end that way. And so I think it is very important, as much as you feel so emotionally stressed, as much as, you're so angry, to kind of take a step back, be smart about the way you approach your divorce from a strategic standpoint on timing, from a process choice that you select, and just even the way that you approach everything, especially if you have children. I just think it's so important to kind of think about everything when you're beginning your divorce process, because again, you can step back, but it's hard. And so it's just very important to make sure you want to get divorced. And if you do, to just start it in the right way.
That's great advice. And you've seen the endings and also the new beginnings for people. So I'm sure that you've witnessed this many times, both the way people started in negative ways or positive ways and how the outcome was very different depending on that. It's kind of like the outfit you put on, the battle armor or the the white dress or whatever it might be to walk into that room. So thank you so much. Well, for everyone listening, if you would like to connect with Jacqueline, you can email her any questions at jnewman, that's JNEWMAN, at berkbot.com. That's BERKBOT. You can connect with her professionally on LinkedIn, and you can order her book, The New Rules of Divorce, on Amazon or at your favorite bookseller. So I hope you'll tune in for our next Pearls of Wisdom podcast and learn from another expert. But thank you so much, Jacqueline, for being here today.
Thanks for having me.
You've been listening to Financial Pearls of Wisdom with Erin Ardleigh. Erin is the founder of Dynama Insurance. For more information, visit dynamainsurance.com. That's DYNAMA insurance.com. This podcast provides inspiration and ideas. It is not to be considered legal or investment advice. It should not replace getting professional advice on your personal situation. You can find this show on all the major platforms, including YouTube, LinkedIn, Facebook, Apple Podcasts, and Spotify. Thank you for your positive reviews and for sharing this show with others.